Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're taking a look at a subscriber deck. It was sent to us by Ezra. It is a Colourless Eldrazi deck, so this is a bit of fun to see the set out. I would say it's a lot better if you add colour in, but for the sake of fun, it is completely colourless. Anyway, I will show you the deck and I'll show you what I mean about it. But yes. Should mention as well, if you're not going to watch the matches next week, I won't be here. So for the game video, we'll have in the comments section a number of archetypes. I'll comment down below. Just leave a like on those, whichever one you'd want, and then when I come back from my holidays, the one with the most likes when I come back will be the deck that I play or build anyway. So anyway, moving on to the deck. So Colourless Eldrazi, what does it do? Well, it never gets mana screwed in terms of colours, so that's good. I have changed up the deck a little bit, by the way, from the subscriber deck. Actually, kind of significantly, because I have already recorded and played matches for the original version, but it just wasn't working out. It was very clunky, so I've kind of fixed it a little bit, not totally. It's not a well supported archetype, I'll say that for a fact. But anyway, guys, let's go on to the match. So, Eldrazi Mimic is our first card. So, whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may change Eldrazi Mimic's base power and toughness to that creature's power and toughness until the end of the turn. So, this is a 2-mana 2/1. It's not bad. It's pretty good, yeah, you could say. But depending on how late the game goes, it gets better and better and better and better. So, you've just played a Mimic, it's lost its summon sickness, and you have found your game winner. Your game winner might be Kozilek, it might be Ulamog, it might be Endbringer. So, whenever these guys enter the battlefield, Eldrazi Mimic takes their power and toughness. So, for 2 mana, essentially Eldrazi Mimic could potentially become a 12/12 in this deck. Could technically be a 14/14 thanks to the ruins putting counters on. If you put them on in response to the trigger, then Eldrazi Mimic gets whatever power and toughness it is at that exact point. So this can be a maximum 14/14, but it's likely going to be about a 4 or 5/5 whenever another creature gets put into the battlefield. So it's really good for that kind of thing. It can sneak out some damage really quickly, surprise your opponents, and yeah, they don't tend to expect it a lot of the time, so it's really good for that. Moving on, we've got a little bit of removal / ramp in Warping Whale. So for 1 and a colourless, we've got an instant speed. We have 3 modes we can choose from. We can only pick 1, unfortunately. However, they are, for example, exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less. So this can exile a Jace, for example. You can get rid of any sort of tokens, Thopters specifically. So it's kind of got a little bit of a synergy for the next Kaladesh set, because you'll be getting rid of a lot of Thopters and servos. So you can get rid of it like that. Also, we can counter target sorcery spells, so we can counter any board wipes like Languish or Planar Outburst or Tragic Arrogance. Any of them we can counter with Warping Whale for 2 mana, which is sweet. And finally, we get to put a 1/1 colourless Eldrazi Scion token onto the battlefield, which we can sack for more mana. So we can also use this to ramp out as well. So if we want to get to some sort of later game thing like Reality Smasher or Warden of Geometries, which is a more solid ramp card, we can get the Scion token and ramp our way into that if we choose to do so. If we're also mana screwed as well, on 2 mana, we can get that 3rd one and maybe Pilgrim's Eye to get out of that mana screw. That kind of thing. So it's got a lot of synergies with the deck. It's pretty good. Moving on, we've got Spatial Contortion. This is probably our premier removal spell. It does what it says every time consistently, and you'll understand what I mean about that when I come to the next bit of removal. So for 2 and a colourless, target creature gets +3, -3 until end of turn. It's also instant speed. So this pretty much kills a lot of creatures in the format. It kills Sylvan Advocates before the mana's come down. Kills all of the creature planeswalkers, I believe. It just yeah, it wipes the board. There's not many creatures in the format that are not really super late game that this wouldn't die to. And in our late game as well, we can use the +3/-3 to put it on our big creatures, which might not kill them. Well, it shouldn't kill them if we're putting it on it, but we can get in an extra 3 damage perhaps, which might be enough to close out the game if they don't expect pump spells in Colourless, which I don't think they ever do. But yes, that's why it's there. And then we've got Pilgrim's Eye, so for 3 mana, we get a flying 1/1 that may search our library for a basic land card and put it into our hand. So it's not ramp, but it is deck thinning. It can allow us to get better draws, essentially, because we don't want to be drawing into lands. One thing this deck doesn't do very well is thin the deck in terms of ramp. We don't have many cards that take lands from your library onto the battlefield, so we want to be thinning as much as possible anyway, because we're using things like Seer's Lantern and stuff like that to ramp rather than our lands, so we don't want to get flooded with mana. So Pilgrim's Eye allows us to grab basic wastes, which we've got 6 of, in order to get a little bit up on our mana count that way. Because at the end of the day, this deck doesn't do much unless it ramps into our late game cards like Walker of the Wastes, Oblivion Sower and all that jazz. Anyway, Matter Reshaper, 2 and a colourless. We get a 3/2, and when it dies, you may reveal the top card of your library. You may put that card onto the battlefield if it's a permanent with mana cost 3 or less. Otherwise, you may put it into your hand. So, this is probably the only card in the deck we want to die because it is ramp. 3 or less is Seer's Lantern or below. So we get Seer's Lantern, another Matter Reshaper, Pilgrim's Eye, Eldrazi Mimic, and then any land also gets triggered by the Matter Reshaper. So we have a lot of things that we can ramp into off the Matter Reshaper, which is pretty awesome. And if we don't, if it's like an Ulamog or something like that, we get it off the top of our deck, back into our hand, and we still get to draw a card that wouldn't be that card anyway. So it's card advantage no matter how it dies, which is pretty awesome. Moving on, we've got Seer's Lantern. So for 3 mana, we get to add 1 colourless to our mana pool. Not great in many decks, but in Colourless Eldrazi, this is essentially a ramp spell for 3. We also have the added bonus of being able to pay 2 and tap to scry 1, so we can set up our future draws as well if we think they might be quite terrible. So it's really good for that. So like turn 2, we might Warping Whale, ramp in with our Scion token. Turn 3, we've got a ramp to our Seer's Lantern. Turn 4, we've got ramp in our Warden. Turn 5, we've got Meteorite. Turn 6, we've got Oblivion Sower. So we've got ramp all the way up to the curve, which is pretty sweet. So we're spending all of our time ramping, and our ramp gets into better ramps, so it's pretty good. Anyway, moving on. Titan's Presence. This is the best removal card, but it's kind of conditional. So for 3 mana at instant speed, as an additional cost to cast it, we have to reveal a colourless creature card from our hand, and we exile a target creature if its power is less than or equal to the revealed card's power. So we want to reveal our biggest creatures with this, which will allow us to remove their biggest, because I can guarantee our biggest is bigger than theirs, or at least on equal level as well. So we Titan's Presence for 3, and we reveal things like Kozilek, and as long as it has 12 power or less or equal, we can exile whatever creature we want. So we can even reveal our Ulamog to exile their Ulamog, so we can have an Ulamog off, and then Ulamog can watch Ulamog get obliterated like that. But yes, it's really good for that. It is kind of conditional though, but we do have some nicely powered creatures here and there, so it's pretty good for that. Alright, moving on. We've got Thought-Knot Seer, so for 3 and a colourless, we get ourselves a 4/4. Nice body, nice toughness, for the same price as the mana. And when it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his hand. You get to choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. So essentially, you get to make your opponent discard a card, except for it gets exiled instead. Downside is when it leaves the battlefield, your opponent gets to draw a card. So the way Thought-Knot Seer is essentially going to work is you're going to cast it, either take a board wipe or something that can remove Thought-Knot Seer. If there's nothing there, then you take the next best card. You might even want to take a Planeswalker or something like that. If there is something in his hand, of course, that can remove Thought Not Seer, but there's something better, then obviously take the thing that's better. But for the most part, you kind of want to keep the 4/4 around, so unless they've got a game-winning card in their hand, you want to take the thing that keeps Thought Not Seer on the battlefield for them not having. Because they just get to redraw otherwise, so they don't get any advantage. But he's a pretty good body. Pretty good for the Eldrazi Mimic as well, 4 mana. And then we've got Warden of Geometries, so for 4 colourless mana, we get a 2/3 with Vigilance, so this is one of the ways that we ramp out a little bit. So we get to add 1 colourless to our mana pool. We can do that after we've attacked as well, so there's that further bit of advantage. We get to attack and then use the mana if it doesn't die to play the next creature card, which is really good. It's only a 2/3 body, but it does get past a lot of things in the early game as well. We can get this down pretty soon as well, due to the sheer amount of ramp that we've got. This is pretty sweet. And the things that we're going to ramp into, we're finally at that point. So for Reality Smasher, we've got 4 and a colourless. We have a 5/5 with Trample and Haste. And when it becomes the target of a spell an opponent controls, that spell gets countered unless they discard a card. So no matter what happens to this card, as long as it resolves, it is a 2-for-1. So you're going to get the value out of this card no matter what happens. If you don't want to run it into a counter spell. That's the only thing that you don't want to do with Reality Smasher. Because if they try to remove it with something like a Murder, if they only have 1 card in their hand and that is the card that they've got, then it gets countered and they can't remove it. They need to draw into another card then to have it discarded to the Reality Smasher. So if your opponent's really low on cards, Reality Smasher is at its finest. And with Trample and Haste, you can usually get in at least some of the damage as well, because it's quite a surprise for your opponent to see a Reality Smasher come down at this time. Though I'd imagine by this point, when we're playing colourless lands and stuff like that, they're going to imagine a 5 mana. At 5 mana, we're going to play a Reality Smasher, so you never know. We'll see. Moving on, we then have 2 Walkers of the Wastes. There are only 2 of because we don't actually run many Wastes in the deck. But for 5 mana, a 4/4 Trample's pretty good. However, it gets +1/+1 for each land you control named Wastes. So all of our basic Wastes give this +1/+1, and we'll be using them to cast it. So it's kind of like Affinity for Artifacts in an Artifact deck. If you play paper, like Pauper stuff, it's that kind of deal. So we're getting bonuses for the lands we're using to cast Walker of the Wastes, which is pretty sweet. Wastes, for those who don't know, are just these ones here. So we have 6 of them, so we have a potential to get +6/+6 on the Walker. So it's going to be a 10/10 for 5 with Trample at its greatest point, which is pretty awesome. Regardless, as long as we have 1 Waste on the battlefield when we cast it, it's a 5/5 for 5 with Trample, which is essentially what Reality Smasher is without the haste and the evasion that it's got. So it's pretty awesome in that sense as well. Moving on, we've got Meteorites. So for 5 mana, when it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So for 5 mana, it's a shock, which is pretty bad. However, it is also a mana rock, which also allows us to add 1 mana of any colour to our mana pool. So Meteorite actually enables all of our special lands to do their thing. So Handwheel Battlements can get haste to creatures. The Blighted Step can gain us life for our creatures. Blighted Gorge can deal damage to our opponents, that kind of thing. So it is a colour enabler while still being colourless, so true to the deck's core concept. And then we've got Oblivion Sower. Oh, Oblivion Sower, I love you. So for 6 mana, we have a 5/8, which is pretty good. Blocks most removal as well, and gets blocks most creatures as well. Hard-casted removal, obviously, is nothing. It's not going to work against Oblivion Sower. Or it is going to work really well, should I say. I am tripping over my words today. So, anyway, when you cast Oblivion Sower, so cast is very important. Regardless of whether this gets countered, this is going to happen. Target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Then you put that many... you put any number of lands that were exiled or in exile onto the battlefield under your control. So, this has potential to ramp us by 4. It has potential to ramp us by 0, so it's kind of hit and miss. We do have ways of making sure that it does hit in Ulamog. So Ulamog, when he enters, he exiles 2 permanents. If you exile the 2 lands from him, then Oblivion Sower, you're guaranteed to get 2 lands off this effect, plus whatever's in the 4 cards that they exile. And there's also, you know, the opportunity that if they're playing some sort of build-around card kind of deck, like if their only win condition is Ulamog, then there is a chance that you exile the top 4 cards and they lose their Ulamog in the process, which might lose them the game. If you hit, like, 3 tutelage out of 4 cards, for example, highly unlikely, of course, but if you did, then tutelage would be up shit creek with Oblivion, so it's pretty sweet like that. But it's another ramp card at 6, which is awesome. And still at 6 mana, we have Endbringer. So for 5 and a colourless, we get a 5/5 that untaps during each player's untap step. So it has pseudo vigilance in a way. So we can attack in with it, and then on our opponent's turn, it untaps so that we can block with it. This is kind of what vigilance does, except for it does still tap, but it will untap on our opponent's turn and ours as well. So it has a multiple abilities that we might want to use. So Endbringer deals 1 damage to target creature or player. If Kaladesh comes around and Thopters become a thing, we'll be able to ping their Thopter tokens or their servo tokens down, which is really good. Also currently pings off a lot of 1 toughness creatures as well, which includes quite a fair few werewolves, if I remember rightly. But like 1/1 tokens, 1/1 plant tokens from Nissa and stuff like that don't stand a chance against Endbringer, and we can do that twice every turn cycle, essentially. We can also prevent a target creature from attacking or blocking, so for 1 mana we can lock down an Ulamog, or lock down some sort of flyer that they're trying to get in with, which is pretty sweet. We can also clear the way for one of our other creatures, perhaps, with this ability. And the bottom one allows us to get card advantage, so for 2 colourless we can tap and draw a card. So we can be drawing 2 cards every turn cycle with Endbringer as long as we've got 4 mana up, which will allow us to refill our hand, which is awesome. So there's a lot of advantage that Endbringer provides. The main reason I was so excited to play this deck is actually to use Endbringer to its fullest potential. So that's what we shall be doing. Moving on, we've got one of our game enders. It's not a game winner, but it's a game ender. Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. Most of you are familiar with him by now, but for those who are not, it is a 10 mana, 10/10 legendary Eldrazi, one of the Eldrazi Titans. When you cast Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, regardless of whether it gets countered or not, this is going to happen. Exile 2 target permanents. So against Mill, you target 2 tutelages. They're probably out of the game at that point. You might want to cut them off a colour by exiling 2 of their lands. If they've got a nice board state with creatures, you might want to get rid of 2 of their biggest creatures. So it's really good for just absolutely wiping out whatever your opponent was planning at that point. It usually closes out the games by that point as well. It also has Indestructible, which means destruction cards like Reprisal and Collective Effort will not kill Ulamog. He will still die to exile, not technically die, but he will still be removed with exile, so you have to worry about that a little bit. But whenever he attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library. Chances are, when this guy comes down, your opponent's on a 2-turn clock, regardless of how much life and how much combat damage you've got in at that point. Because even if they block the 10 damage, they're still exiling 20 cards of their library. And the chance is that they'll have probably thinned at least 10 cards out of the deck, so, you know, 20 cards off the top of the library is usually a turn 2 clock, or maybe even a 3 if they're not in that area, but doesn't matter if you get damage in. But if you want, we do have Rogue's Passages to get in that 10 damage anyway. Next we've got Kozilek, the Great Distortion, the other Eldrazi Titan. It's a shame we don't have the third one. Emrakul. 8 and 2 colourless. When you cast Kozilek, yet again, regardless of whether it gets countered, the Kozilek, the Great Distortion, if you have fewer or 7 cards in hand, draw cards equal to the difference. So, chances are, this is going to be the last card you play in your hand. If it is, you draw 7 cards. Whatever happens, you draw back up to your full hand size. It is a 12/12 with Menace, which makes it horrible for your opponent to block. They have to double block it at least. They're probably going to do that anyway if they're trying to kill it. But the likelihood is that they're not trying to kill it, they're probably trying to chomp it. So they're going to lose 2 plant tokens, for example. And if they try to remove it, if they try to wipe our board, for example, we can discard a card with converted mana cost X. So whatever card we discard, with our 7 cards that we've refilled, which gives it that kind of protection, we get to counter that spell with converted mana cost X. So if they Planar Outburst, we exile Meteorite, Walker of the Wastes, or Reality Smasher. That's X equals 5. We can get rid of Planar Outburst and Tragic Arrogance. If 4 is what we need to get rid of, we have Thought-Knot Seers and Warden of Geometries to exile that. If they're going to try murder, we have Titan's Presence, Seer's Lantern, Matter Reshaper, Pilgrim's Eye, that kind of thing. And if they have some sort of 2-mana bounce spell, Spatial Contortion, Warping Wail, or Eldrazi Mimic, we do have a nice enough curve for Kozilek to essentially have all the mana costs that you need for X to be worth it. And then, of course, we keep drawing into spells as well, so even if we're discarding our hand to try to keep Kozilek and the rest of our board state alive, we're still going to be replacing some of those cards as well, so it's pretty awesome. So that's essentially the deck. Moving on to the lands, of course, we have 6 wastes. The only reason we're running wastes over just normal generic colourless things is because of the Walker of the Wastes and the Pilgrim's Eyes. We need basics to grab, and we need named wastes, essentially. So we have 6 wastes in there. I did remove Westvale Abbey because I just didn't see Westvale Abbey's trigger being achievable. We're going for like little big creatures, a small amount of big creatures, so Westvale Abbey never really did that kind of work, so that's why we cut him out, and then I ended up putting Waste in its place. But yes, Waste are really good for that kind of thing. Ruins of Oran Reef enters the battlefield tapped and adds a colourless, and we can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target colourless creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So we can boost any of our creatures by 1, whatever they are. We can do it in response to an Eldrazi Mimic trigger, so that we can get an extra power and toughness off the Eldrazi Mimic that way, which is pretty sweet. Should state that the rest of these lands just add colourless, so I'll go into what's special about them, rather than what they actually add mana. So, Gaia Reach Sanitarium, a legendary land, and you tap 2, each player draws a card, then discards a card. So we're allowed to loot a little bit to find more answers to get rid of the crap that's in our hand. Maybe we just drew into a waste, we get to do a redraw. If we Drownyard Temple, for example, we can discard that and use the 3 mana to ramp with it. So we can get that advantage. Handwave Battlements, we can use our Meteorite or our Crumbling Vestiges, that I'll show you in a second, to give our creatures haste. So if we have Walker of the Wastes, we can add an extra 1 to give it haste and get in like a Reality Smasher in that sense. Drownyard Temple, as I mentioned, a 3 mana ramp spell if you can get it into your graveyard, which is pretty good. Foundry of the Consoles, you can tap 5 and you get to put 2 1/1 colourless Thopter artifacts onto the battlefield. So we don't have any reach or any flyers, so this is likely good defense against any sort of flying defense. It also allows us to get a little bit of damage over the top as well if we want to close out. That's just that little bit of extra damage, so it's really good for that. Once we're done with our lands as well, this is what's really good about this deck. Once we don't need the extra mana, if we're flooded for example, we can just sack these lands away for value, which is really good. Blighted Steppe, only a 1-off, because as I mentioned before, we're not really getting a high creature count, but you get, for 3 and a white, you gain 2 life for each creature you control. So against aggro strategies, that might save us just that little bit. Just a little teeny little bit of life might just be all we need, so that's why it's in there. Blighted Gorge, for 4 and a red, you get to sacrifice it and deal 2 damage to target creature or player. Yet again, closes in that last little extra bit of damage if they're really close to being dead. Kills a flyer or any sort of 2 toughness creature that you might want to get rid of, so that's why it's there. Rogue's Passage, this is a game-winning land in itself. So 4, you get to tap it, and target creature can't be blocked this turn. So for 4 mana, your 12/12 can't be blocked, and your opponent's dead in 2 turns from that point forward, which is pretty sweet. We tend to always see Rogue's Passage. I haven't had a game once yet where Rogue's Passage didn't make it into the game at some point to be relevant, which is awesome. And finally, Crumbling Vestige. It enters the battlefield tapped, however when it enters, you get to add 1 mana of any colour to your mana pool. So it's a tap land that acts as though it's not, and it allows us to do things like get haste on our handwheel battlements, or do Blighted Step or Gorge, that kind of thing. And from any point on, it's just a colourless mana from that point on. Alright guys, that's going to do it for the deck, so be sure to leave a like if you like the look of the deck, it helps me out a great deal. And subscribe if you haven't already for more Magic Duels and other content. If you're not sure what that other content is, then stay for the end card, see the rest of the content I've got to offer, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.